Hi everyone, welcome to the latest edition of the Halftime Club. Today's topic is around coaching styles, and again with our topics, they are really broad, as long as wide as you want to make them. So hopefully we provide a little bit of an insight into coaching styles, what it means, what it could include, and hopefully give you some practical things to go away with and practice in your environment. So we'll start off today with a workshop breakdown as usual, where we discuss what we're going to probably look at today. We're going to speak about how we might break down coaching styles and what it may mean. We're going to look at coaching behaviours and how it links to the planning model that some of you may be familiar with. Also, how we might communicate with our players and things we may need to consider. How we can have supportive coaching behaviours. We're going to look at some simple coaching styles and how that may impact on decision making as well as learning. The intervention wheel and some examples around that. And then finally, as usual, some final considerations when coaching. So to start off, a really simple question, but hopefully there's a lot of depth in some of the answers and responses. What is a coaching style? What may determine what it is, for example? Use the Q&A function at the top of your screen. You should see a little speech bubble with a question mark in, or the chat function if that's unable to be used. So yeah, can you just please populate some of your answers in there? What is a coaching style? And use the Q&A. Cheers. So Emma shared about a coach style being something that's transformational. Jimmy said how you approach things and your personality when coaching. Christopher shared around how you train and manage your players. Elliot shared like a specific approach you may make to coach a team or an individual, whether something softer and more comforting, others be more direct. Stuart said the method and style of communication. Mark said the way in which you approach training your games, the players, and your attitude. So some very familiar sort of words and terminology we're using here to describe this, but actually there's small nuances within what we're saying. So we speak about attitude, difference within the group, how we might manage that difference, again, different methods of how we do it, your training being transformational. What is your intended outcome behind the way you coach? Thanks everyone for that. So we're going to move on now. So there's not really a definition of a coaching style, but what it is, it's something probably based on how we communicate. It's probably something to consider how we act with our players and how we interact with other people, how we support individuals and other people, how we listen, how good we are receiving information, how we lead people. It can be something based around previous experience, and there's a lot more. So I guess really a coaching style can be considered to be more than simply a way of coaching, but instead it's probably an accumulation and blend of different methods and techniques that together inform and therefore form who you are, what you value, and how you act. So it could be broken down into more areas, but obviously this list is by no means exhaustive. So we're going to share on the next page. So those of you that have completed the UEFA C license, and you may have seen this in other areas as well, of the planning model. Now, the planning model provides coaches with a simple framework to help when designing and planning their sessions. The elements, which I'm going to go through shortly, ask coaches to be more thoughtful and considerate about why they do what they do. So if we look at the above areas here, we have player engagement. So that's how we want to engage the players in the learning activity. How do we want them to feel throughout the practice? We have practice designing learning activity. So what are we putting on for them? So provide them the opportunity to work at what we say we want to work at. The intended outcomes are the what. So what do we want the players to get better at today? And then the coach behaviours is how do we want to act? How the players going to see us today? What are we going to do to try and add value? Now, importantly, these things all interact together when we're using this model to help plan our sessions. And again, if you're not familiar with this, just take a little time to think about it and consider that. Do I do this in my approach so far? If I don't, it might be something worth considering. Now, the important thing with this interacting planning model that it appears and occurs over different timeframes. So what we'll speak about today is when we communicate with people, sometimes we may change what we do within 5 minutes. We may change it over a period of a week. It may be over a month. It may be over a season, either because of our experiences so far have educated us to change how our approach and what we do, or it might be that the needs of the players in front of us is changing and we need to respond to that. So importantly, though, based on coaching styles being our theme for the halftime club today, coach behaviour sits as an important area within the framework, and it's probably something we don't value enough. So we might think about it briefly, but how in depth do we actually go about this? And hopefully, what we'll do today is break it down to a bit more detail. So, an important part about coaching is communication. Our ability to communicate with our players is really important. So what we're going to look at today is break down the idea of communication to some elements that hopefully we can then reflect on. So first of all, really obvious one to start off with, coaches must have the ability to send information out. So what I mean by that is you're talking to someone. So that could be, for example, a coaching point you're trying to deliver to your players. It could be a question you're trying to ask your players. It could even be your co-coach or the people that are helping you or the parents. Okay, so you must have the ability to send information out. Now, on the flip side of that, we also have to be comfortable receiving information back. So how good we are actually actively listening to people when they speak to us. And sometimes what can happen as a coach is we're too busy delivering and sending out information and we're actually not ready and receptive enough to receive it at the same time. And sometimes it can make players feel a little bit insecure about what they're doing in that moment because you're not actually open to listening. And sometimes because we're not comfortable receiving information, sometimes we can actually lack the skill set to do it as well and to receive and listen. In addition, communication can occur either through a verbal or non-verbal response. So a verbal is really obvious, that's how we speak. But non-verbal could be our actions as well. So that could be throwing your hands up in the air if something's not gone well in the game. It could be giving someone the eye or raising your eyebrows. It could be turning your back to a player. It could be deliberately ignoring them and not looking at them. So communication is verbal and non-verbal. And we do these things naturally, but hopefully what this provides a little bit of a formal framework to why we do what we do. And then finally, communication requires delivery of content. So what I mean by that is you're trying to tell something about something, why, how, where, when, who, what, things like that. So we deliver content, but that's delivered within the idea of having emotion wrapped around it. So what I mean by that is I can deliver with a different tone, for example. So I might send a message out saying, can you pass the ball? And I might then share it in a lot firmer tone. Hey, can you pass the ball? And the emotion can be wrapped around the content. So all these things together are the building blocks and elements that relate to communication. So again, if you're thinking about this now going, oh, actually, I don't think I receive information that well. Actually, a lot more of what I do is verbal, and I've never really thought about my non-verbal cues and my communication or the emotion in which you do it. Hopefully, this gives you a little bit of a thought process to consider within that. So we're going to look at some examples here. We're going to take a really deep dive into why communication sometimes can be ineffective. Now, very rarely do we consider what we say to be ineffective unless the person on the receiving end provides us feedback. So what I mean by that feedback is you might tell a player something, they might not go and do it, and then that's coming back to you and you're going, right, have I said it in the wrong way? On the other hand, I can actually unintentionally ignore that feedback, and this is where things can become ineffective because I haven't got that. I lack that self-awareness as a coach to recognise when my communication's not working in that moment. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, we have player, and there's a communication channel between the player and the coach, and we're going to go up and down this scale. So we're going to look at a few examples of why communication can sometimes be effective, and the first one we'll look at is this. So the athlete or the player lacking adequate listening or non-verbal skills misinterprets the content of the message or fails to understand it. Now that sounds quite formal what we've got there, but actually it happens really often. So the player we're speaking to doesn't have the adequate listening skills to actually recognize and interpret the content we're trying to share with them. And that's a sort of example when you say, player A, can you do this? And they nod, they go out there and they can't apply it. Okay, so actually what they're doing is satisfying the need to give you an answer by nodding, but their actually ability to process the information isn't quite there yet. Another example is that the athlete or player does not receive the message because he or she is not paying attention. Now, we can all say to players, hey, you're not paying attention, they might be bouncing a ball, etc., etc. And again, paying attention is really key to learning anyway. Now, it doesn't just have to be looking, it could be listening, it could be those different things. Now, we have to recognize as well as coaches that when we're asking players to pay attention, they don't have to look at you to be able to listen. We just have to recognize that, again, we're looking for feedback to understand if they have had attention in some way based on what we're saying, for example. Thirdly, one example here is the athlete or player understands the content of the message but misinterprets the intent. Now, when we speak about the term intent, obviously we can have different tones of our voice and we can have different things we try to say to try and nudge people along the journey in different ways. So just really think about the intent behind what you say. Some people and some players don't have the social skill set at this current moment in time to read the room a little bit. Okay, so just again, something to consider. Another example, the messages sent by the coach are inconsistent, leaving the player confused about what is meant. Now, this is a really tricky one because I'm a firm believer of, do what you say you're going to do. And if there's a gap between what you're saying and what you're doing, it probably needs to close down and narrow up. Because essentially what can happen is the players then begin to feel insecure because they actually don't know what you're going to say from day to day, session to session, from minute to minute. So if there's inconsistencies in your delivery of your message and your communication, whether that's non-verbal or verbal, or the tone you use, then there will be some insecurities that players will have with actually being able to communicate back to you, because they actually probably more likely to switch off and ignore you and take themselves away from the situation than they are to engage. Another example, the content to be communicated by the coach is wrong for the situation. Now, this can be interpreted in lots of different ways. Now, a really simple phrase is if you can't see it, you can't coach it. And in my experience, I've been to lots of games, even cup final games, and observed coaches on the sidelines, and the information they send out to their players isn't actually related to what's actually happening on the pitch. Then what then can happen is then they end up then shouting towards their players and communicate information which isn't relevant, and they get more frustrated and more frustrated with the players because they think what they're saying is true and it actually isn't. And the player in their head's probably going, well, that didn't actually happen, coach. But there was no position there where the coach is actually allowing a two-way conversation between the player. So what can happen is if your understanding of certain detail isn't there, you're probably better off saying anything, because actually what you can do is provide the wrong information at the wrong time for the wrong situation, and it has no correlation. And there's the sort of moments where players look at you and go, what's going on here? So just something to consider. And then a final example, the message does not communicate what the coach intends because the coach lacks the necessary verbal or non-verbal skills. So again, very similar to the previous one, but what I want to send out to people isn't getting across because maybe I haven't got the knowledge about what I'm trying to say. I haven't got the simplicity of language to get over what I want. So, and by the way, you don't have to have this in your locker immediately, but what you've got to do over, as you gain experience as a coach, is recognize, is there a better way I can say this? Is there some little trigger words and action words and cues and analogies that get the players to consider what I want them to say? And do they actually understand what them analogies mean? To give you an example, if I say to a player, lock the door, and that's just an example I use, what I'm looking for is the defenders, when the ball's gone past them, are you in a position ready to defend if the ball comes back quickly? But if I just said lock the door without any underpinning understanding of my players of what that actually means, then there's a gap there between the two things. So whatever analogies and language you use, do your players actually understand what that means? And it's fine if it's your own way of doing it, but everyone has to have an understanding of what that actually means. So eventually at the end of this, what we're going to do, we're going to start getting you to be a little bit self-aware, and we're going to ask you some questions, and hopefully you feel comfortable sharing some things in the group. Now, this is quite wordy, this page, in terms of the amount of information, so I'm going to take my time to go through it. But I want you to really start thinking about yourself as I go through these things, and think about where you position yourself on these scales. And again, I'm not looking to catch anyone out. We're here to learn and get better. So hopefully at the end of it, you feel like you're in a good position to share some thoughts and maybe some challenges that you faced when you're out there coaching on the grass or on match day or in training or when communicating with your players. So some coaching considerations. So when we speak about coaching, we speak about communicating, credibility is really key. Now, credibility isn't something you just earn, it's something that is built up over time. Okay, so it comes back to, are you doing what you say you are, or are you a coach that preaches rather than coaches? So just think about where you might position yourself on this scale. Do you think you have low credibility with your players, or do you think you have higher? And if you do, think about the why. um, so I think it's really key. We speak about credibility often in business and in workplaces, in politics and stuff like that. So are you doing what you say you're doing? Are you preaching rather than actually delivering information that's impactful? As a coach, obviously we always make judgments on people, on players, and moments. I think you consider this scale. So negative judgments are probably where you frequently criticize players. You're slow to praise things, whereas positive judgments is the opposite of that. Okay, so just think about where you might sit on this scale. Think about maybe like a 1 to 5 scale, for example. Um, are you a coach that's high in judgment or high in information? So, do you blame rather than provide value and support? Or are you constantly evaluating players rather than actually supporting them with the information that will support them in the future? So, as coaches, sometimes what we can do is we coach in hindsight, we coach in the past. So, we see someone do something and then we say, oh, you should have done that, or think about this next time. That moment probably is very unlikely to ever happen again. So, actually, what you're doing is judging them in a way. What you probably need to do more of as a coach is actually coach in the future a little bit. So you need to prepare them for things they're likely to face on a repetitive basis. So again, these aren't right or wrong. Just think, do you find yourself more in the judgment area of this or more providing information? In terms of reinforcement, um, reinforcement's a really interesting one. When we speak about managing behaviour, we know behaviour can be getting worse in the grassroots setting, and it's getting worse in schools at the minute. I've been fortunate to work in some different schools over my career. And some coaches and teachers are poor at reinforcing things, and some that are really strong at it. And what I mean by that is, you might be reinforcing the wrong behavior at the wrong time, or you might be letting things go too much as a coach, or the opposite is you come down too hard for things that don't require that level of consequence from that behavior, for example. So do you reinforce the positive things, and you continue that without obviously overpraising too much, or do you reinforce the behaviors at the wrong time? So if you're saying to, for example, that I want you to act like this, and then you shout across the pitch, and are you reinforcing the wrong things because you're delivering a message in a different way to what you're actually saying you want to happen? Inconsistent messages, and this is I see a lot of in coaching, to be fair. Part of it's due or a lack of self-awareness about what you're saying, or maybe a lack of understanding. So what you want to try and avoid as a coach is today saying one thing and tomorrow saying another. So what I mean by that, and we'll use an example which can happen quite often. If you say to your players before you go into the game, don't argue with the officials, but then you do, you're being extremely inconsistent in your messaging, in your style of coaching. So if you're going to say to people this, then you probably need to follow through with it. And that comes down to the credibility part as well. Even when it comes down to coaching technical detail, anything tactical, if you're going after something, be consistent with it. That doesn't mean you can't change your approach, but be consistent with how you deliver these messages. When it comes to listening, some considerations: are you an effective listener or a poor listener? So do you speak too much to actually listen? Do you believe you hold all the knowledge to actively listen? And by the way, again, this is not wrong having more knowledge than the people you're speaking to, but are you using it in a way to beat people down or to support them in the moment when it's required? Expression, and this again is a really key one as well. Um, Everyone has a different personalities and ways they've been brought up, and their different social circles, and what they like and what they don't like in life. But expression's really key when dealing with players. If you have poor expression, what you like to do is never show any emotion, and it leaves players quite insecure. And what I'm not saying is you have to jump up and down, and swing your arms around and cheer everything. But what I'm saying is there has to be a consistency of expression that the players can actually tangibly see and feel. So, for example, it could be high fives, it could be a pat on the back, well done, it could be teammates cheering each other on. But it's that ability to highlight and express feelings and emotion to people. Obviously, if you're strong in that expression there, then players will feel very secure in knowing who you are and how you act. So just something to consider. Finally, poor in instruction or strong in instruction. So are you unable to explain anything at a level that's understandable to the player in your care? And again, that comes back to knowledge, content, ability to deliver it. So yeah, there's a lot there, and hopefully I broke it down a little bit. But now what I'd like you to do, and we'll take a while on this, I'd like you to start self-reflecting on a few areas. And if you feel comfortable enough, you don't have to do this on everything. You might just pick something that's jumped out to you. Just use the Q&A function to share some examples and go, actually, I think I do this well, and maybe I don't do that well. I'd like to improve this area. But yeah, if you feel comfortable to do it, please share it in the Q&A, and it'll be a good opportunity to have a discussion regarding it. Remember, this halftime cup will be posted on YouTube at some stage as well. So you don't have to remember all this and screenshot it. You can also reflect this at different times as well. But yeah, if you're happy to share some bits, I think it'd be really beneficial for the group to sort of be vulnerable a little bit and share these thoughts. Yeah. So we've got Andrew saying I find it easy to demonstrate through actions as I sometimes struggle verbally. So that might be something to consider in terms of actually deliberately trying to verbalize different things as well, to see if you can get that balance between the two. It doesn't mean it's wrong having one more than the other, but it might be something to consider. Have we thought about the impact it might have on our players? Some of them might require some verbal information and communication. Thanks for that. Yeah, Michelle, about you think you're in a good position regarding positive reinforcement, though you could overdo it, and that's very easy to do, by the way. Sometimes we can overpraise and over reinforce, and actually that can actually have a negative effect, which is really interesting. And we was having a conversation once with on a course I was on, and we were speaking about overpraising, and we were saying if a player does something well that you've asked them to, then you say, yeah, brilliant, well done, you really reinforce that message. But the next time it happens again, you start to just dull down your praise to a point where hopefully it just becomes a thumbs up or it just becomes a little glance. And the reason behind what we don't want to do is go overboard, because actually we need to start dedicating our time to other people as well. And we don't want to keep them going along a path of waiting for us to provide them positive reinforcement. At some stage, they should actually have some internal praise that they go, do you know what, I've done that well? So just think about how you start. You might start high with your reinforcement and gradually begin to scale it down as they do the same things regularly. Because what gets rewarded gets repeated. But what we don't want to do is continue to reward things which become basic in our view that we think will continue. But that's a great point to share. Yeah, that's a great point around coaching, around judgment. Yeah, but it happens quite often when we say to players, "Oh, can you think about this next time or do this next time?" But again, that the opportunity is probably gone now. And actually, there's a lot of research regarding this, that sometimes the verbal response you get back from players doesn't actually correlate to what's actually happened, because reality is they're probably not seeing exactly what you've seen, and they're probably not even paying attention to that. So what they'll do is they'll just give you an answer that satisfies your need because you've asked a question, because you're their key attachment figure, you're the coach. Very rarely you get players go, I don't know, coach. Very rarely. Most will give you some response. So yeah, preparing them before the moment happens as much as possible is probably going to be more beneficial, because actually then they're probably going to pay attention to stuff that you're paying attention to, and the communication becomes a lot more deliberate and a lot more purposeful. So great shout there. Got a few here to go through. Yeah, culture, yeah, develop credibility over time. Yeah, 100%. It's not something that's instant, but we speak about it like it's a quick fix, but it's not. So agreed. Um, yeah, less judgmental when things go wrong. Work more on praise the team, stressing the positives. Yeah, listening can be difficult when all the team are talking at once. You're working on ways where only one person speaks at a time. Yeah, and you can also do buddy systems as well. So if you don't want to make players feel uncomfortable sharing things, you could have like you buddy up, then in them buddy they share their voice through one person. So there's no right or wrong. You could even have captains of communication, for example, where they are the designated spokesperson for that week or that session or that match, and they're only sharing the thoughts, not just their own, but they're sharing the thoughts of everyone. And it also provides an opportunity to work at some social skills as well. Yeah. Credibility depends on the player 100%. Yes, it's a reciprocal process, of course. Yep, generational, 100%. Yeah, and I might shed about, good at being positive, asking, identifying what a player could do differently, talking about it when they come off, the challenges to extract out something and apply it to situations that may reoccur. Yeah, so it's like that rule of three. If it happens once, happens twice, happens three times, it might happen again. If it happens only once, and if you're going to ask a question about it, unless it's related to their learning over the previous week or season, for example. So let's say you've worked at passing and they had an opportunity to work at a pass, maybe you practice, for example, then you might want to nudge that along because it's really relevant to that time. But if it's just random noise coming at them, they're probably not going to realise it's happening because it's only happened once. So it's that continuity of learning, that time on task, that familiarisation with the content you're about to deliver, only works if they are familiar with it. If it's just random stuff getting told to them, they might find it really hard to interpret that information based on what you said about some things are ineffective. Yeah, Mark said about never getting too high or too low, excited or disappointed. I think it's really key for a coach as well that when we speak about expression, we don't have to be at either end of the spectrum. We can be in the middle, but we just have to recognise when to shift a little bit. Um, Strong reinforcement now. When we speak about reinforcement, if we have people that are exhibiting poor behaviour, we have to reinforce that that's not really good. And again, in my experience, I see a lot of coaches try and meet the needs of the player before they deal with the behaviour, and actually needs to flip it the other way around. So yes, I mean, need to seek to understand why behaviour happens, but if behaviour is unacceptable, hey, get back in your box, then I'll speak to you. So that reinforcement, recognising at the right time to use it. So it's not, oh, how are you? Hey, no, your behaviour is unacceptable. Get back in. Then once you're back in, then we'll have a conversation. Until that point, no conversation. Otherwise, you end up you're essentially rewarding them with a nice, comfortable conversation when their behaviour is not really good. Got loads here. Thanks everyone, by the way. I'm trying to get through all these. Yeah, games that keep instructions short and to the point in training. Yeah, long explanations, players switch off, and probably if it's not relevant to them as well. So when we speak to players, when we're doing like our pre-match or we've got a tactic board out, be really specific, saying, "Oh, Jimmy, I want you to do this when you're on the pitch. Sarah, can you do this? The back line together, I want you to think about this." And all of a sudden, their attention switched on. If you just speak generically, they might miss what their role is in that. Yeah, players can become embarrassed, and again, it's just recognising the needs of the players. By the way, this is no silver bullet. By the way, what we're speaking about. Yeah, Jimmy. Yeah, thanks. I really like that. So you work really hard this year, keeping your message instructions consistent. Um, yeah, if you change your pre-match stuff too much, players get a bit confused. And I think that's really key when we speak about things like warm-ups and stuff like that. Consistency is probably really good. If they're having to relearn or learn a new practice, for example, or a new coaching behaviour, or get used to it before game starts every week, they're going to feel really uncomfortable, a bit anxious about the game coming up. They're probably going to overthink things, and we know that the more conscious thoughts become, the bigger the impact on performance. So actually having a consistency to what you do, it's your behaviours, your communication, the organisation of your warm up, really, really can help. keep things consistent the same. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, 100% see the benefits. Agree. Yeah, about engaging in practice. Now, not Christopher saying about in practicing drills. Now, depending on what practice you work on in the spectrum, let's use an post for example. Sometimes they can be boring, and that's okay. It's okay to be bored sometimes for players, but if they understand the why and the how, and you explain that to them, and you, like I said, you direct that communication to them with the content, they might buy into it. So it's really key again that you don't just do something and go, oh, get on with it. You're not working hard enough. Actually, no. Explain to them the why, explain to them the how, and it still might not work, but at least you're engaging them in that process of learning. Um, yeah, managing the seriousness. Yeah, brilliant, Gavin. Yeah, parents can be a difficult one. It's the dreaded P word. Parents and referees normally the dreaded words when we speak about consistency of messaging. But bring the parents on board. Tell them this is what we're going to work at this week. Get them to come in and listen. Get them to have regular meetings through the season, not just one at the beginning of the season, because things can change. We're speaking about these are the messages we're sending the players. Even in, you can't control what the parents say to their child or the player outside of your environment, but what you can do is nudge the parents along by saying, look, we've worked on this week. When you ask them stuff, and by all means we're not saying you can't, can you just raise these couple of questions to them and just let me know what their feedback was, and you just engage them in that process. And again, you can't control what parents do. You're never ever going to be able to do that, but what you can do is just nudge them along and bring them on side a little bit. Right, thanks everyone. That's really good. So again, this stuff will go up on YouTube at some stage. So hopefully you can reflect on this at a later point if you want to as well. So supportive coaching behaviours. I think to be a supportive coach, you probably need a positive blend of all the previous areas we've spoken about. Okay, you're not going to be able to remember them all again, but it's just you need to consider them. There is no one way to communicate, as we've highlighted already, but we must be considerate about the intended and unintended impact it may have on the individual receiving it. So what I mean by that is there are unintended consequences to what we do, and we may not be in a position experience-wise to understand what they may be, but the more you coach and the more you try different levels and ways to communicate, the more likely you are to feel out what them unintended outcomes might be. Yes, there will be elements where you get a surprise and you go, whoa, I didn't expect that to happen. But that's coaching. Coaching is complex. You're dealing with humans that are complex. They're not complicated. They're just complex, and it just takes more time to work out what their needs might be. So I guess a bit of Latin. I don't speak Latin very well, but primum non nocere. So first, do no harm. So to be a supportive coach, first you do no harm. Yes, that's a safeguarding thing as well, but from a coach perspective as well, that's something to consider. And where possible, always try to add value. So respond to the needs of your players, not just what you want to do. Respond to their needs. Then you're probably going to add value, and make sure you're doing no harm when you're interacting with them and communicating with them. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some really simple coaching styles, and we're going to look at three. And you'll be familiar with these, but maybe not in a formal framework as such. So it kind of goes along a spectrum. So the first thing is the coach decides. So my style is I decide what the players learn, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how they act. There's a two-way relationship, reciprocal relationship. So, we're bouncing off each other, might want to do this, or what can I think about this, etc., etc. Or there's where the player decides. Now, the next question I might ask might be really simple, but I want you again to start thinking in detail around coaching styles a little bit more. So just start to think about when might each style be appropriate to use and why. And if you've got examples of doing it in the past, let us know. And if you can share that on the Q&A function. Cheers. You can even share some things to the group that have gone well for you, where you've tried them as well. Stu's shared about, last session of the term or season when there's perhaps more focus and fun, the player can decide that. Yes, I might have shared about the coach decides on the framework of learning, for example, and ask the players within the framework what we could do to achieve the ends. And that's a really nice balanced approach. And this will hopefully arrows like a little, a sliding scale. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be, like I said, that two-way relationship between, well, I'm going to do this bit, and what are you going to give back to support that, getting towards that area. You couldn't share about when they've encountered a problem and have the knowledge and understanding to solve it. So I'm assuming that means, like, a player might be able to decide the next approach when they have the understanding and the knowledge to support that. Yeah, 100%. And I think linking to that as well was, and we'll speak about this in a moment regarding interventions. If a player doesn't have the underpinning knowledge, asking lots of questions is not helpful. Actually, it's going to make them more anxious and more uncomfortable. So recognise that it might be the coach needs to decide in that moment. Andrew said about allowing the players to decide the arrival warm up, which is always fun. Yeah, so things like that could be done on the day, it can be done in advance, it could be done in the previous session. Can you think about, can you send me a session over for a warm up for the next week or something like that? It gives them that autonomy, that agency. Let me show the coach decide when they all want to play up front. Yep, two-way angels ask players to increase how to increase difficulty. Yeah, they might say, oh, can we try this? Players on the pitch, who covers who, takes a corner. Yeah, and look, there's only so much we can do on a match day. The players are going to be out there making decisions. Obviously, we can have an impact on that. It's just recognising where it fits in on that scale. Yeah, Jimmy split all three up, saying like coach during the training sessions, two-way, pre-game asked about what they've learned in training, how they could implement it. Player deciding the game, leave them to it with hope, what they've learned in training, what you discussed before the match. So again, it's not a right or wrong here. It's just recognise that we can move up and down this scale at different points, and our style can adapt and change. So really, the answer to this is it depends. There's no right or wrong. It's just beginning to understand why and what I'm trading off. So if the coach decides everything, I'm trading off a bit more decision making from the players. It doesn't mean they aren't making decisions, but I'm trading it off for my judgments and my opinion. Vice versa, when we impact the players, and I might want to impact the detail early so they get a bit of structure, a bit of familiarization, then I can start to shift down the scale and loosen up my control over the players. So actually what I'm doing is I'm supporting them with a lot of high structure, high support, and I'm loosening up as I go through their learning experience. Okay, so moving on then. So thanks all for that. So we're going to look at the intervention wheel. Now, I couldn't really fit a wheel with all this information on the same page. So I'm going to look at it in this way to start off with, and then we'll look at it in the wheel on a separate page. So interventions are what we do when we communicate. And the idea behind it is, what am I trying to get out of this? Who's delivering and how am I delivering it? So the first one, and these aren't color coded in terms of bad or good, by the way, they just happen to be colored in this way, is command. So a command is where the coach tells and shows the required solution. So it might be, example, I want you to do this. Okay. So the coach tells, explains, and shows how to do it. Often this can come with negative connotations. Again, modern day coaching tends to push you away from this, but actually it is a tool to use in your toolbox. It is not negative. Think back to how breaking a communication, the emotion you attach to the content dictates the intent behind it. So if you're saying it in a way where you're making them feel bad, then yes, it can be a difficult thing to make, but you can do that across any intervention. But if a player lacks the required understanding and knowledge to be able to do something, then you need to tell them. Don't keep asking them questions because you know the answer, but they clearly don't. So all you're doing is keep going, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And actually you're making them really uncomfortable. Just tell them. They need your help. That's what you're there for. And that could be from player to player as well, not just coach to player. Question and answer. I would say a majority of people do more questioning and answering in their delivery of their practice. So a coach leads with a question to gain a response from a player. So what do you think about this? So coach poses a question and players offer a verbal solution to the challenge. But again, just think about this. If you say this in hindsight, if you say this post-event, they might not always be able to relate to that information. They still have to have seen it to be able to talk about it. Otherwise, they end up just making it up to satisfy your needs, which we have to be careful with as a coach. Observation and feedback. So coach and players observe something. So let's watch this together or have a look at how they're doing this. It might be you have a defender off the pitch, they look at their teammate going, look how he defends. Can you think about how you can do similar? So players and coach observe and discuss feedback. So that generally can happen on one-to-ones, that can be off the pitch. It can happen on it as well. Guided discovery. So coach asks a question or issues a challenge. So can you show me ways you which you do this? So it could be something rather than saying, can you think about this next time? Just say, can you show me different passes you can make today? Can you show me a switch of play when it's on? And that final bit when it's on is really key. It's not do it because I'm telling you. When you think it's on, can you give it a go? Can you show me? So coach challenges and players offer a visual demonstration of possible solution. Okay, trial and error. Players and or a coach decide on the challenge. Go and try it for yourself. So you pose them it and off they go, and you just observe and you watch. So players encouraged to find solutions with minimal support from the coach. So you're looking for them to internalize that feedback to work out what might be best. You might get them to reflect that feedback back to ensure that they're thinking about things on the right page. So this is a sort of many different interventions. You probably find you've done some of these, or you might find yourself you do more of these. In general, if I had to be really generic and stereotype coaches, generally more of them are question and answer now than they are across the others. Okay, you tend to find the coaches that are maybe working at a higher level to have more of a command approach, I would say, okay, because their understanding of when to step in is a lot higher. So those that are novice learners, probably more question and answer, and those that are more high level, probably more command. So again, there's no right or wrong, it's just recognizing when to use certain things. So all these interventions can focus on specific corners as well around the four corner model. So if you're not familiar with that, that's technical, tactical, that's social, psychological, that's social. So for example, if I'm using the command approach, it might be, I want you to receive with the foot furthest from the defender, which is something technical. Or it might be, hey, you're good enough to keep the ball, demand it whenever possible. So I'm commanding them to have a little bit different attitude in the game. Or it might be when X player is outnumbered, I want you to move where they can see your feet. So they're all command, but they're specific to different areas of the four corner model. So remember, emotion though is different to the command. You can have positive tone in a command intervention. So why is it a wheel? And obviously I couldn't fit this on one page. It's because it's picking the right tool at the right time. And these tools are ever changing and evolving. You could change your intervention within 2 minutes, 5 minutes over the course of a week, a season with these players. Okay. So it's recognizing that things are constantly evolving. You can impact the whole team with these interventions. You can impact a small group or a unit. You can impact individuals. So yeah, they're all tools to use at the right time. And I think a really key thing is recognize when to provide more structure, when to loosen it up, when to start more loose, when to feel confident, all these things to consider. And it's beyond the scope of an hour webinar to discuss this. So I guess now coming back to you guys to populate stuff in the Q&A, pick an intervention style and share some examples of where you might use these styles, share some examples maybe where you haven't used these much, or you think you do too much of one and not the other. Think about where a certain style hasn't worked with a certain player. Yeah, so yeah, please populate some stuff in the Q&A and we'll share it out. So Carl shared about using observation and feedback, or one player can do something and demonstrate it to the rest of the team. It's really interesting, that one as well. I was fortunate to work with some ex-professionals on coaching courses when we were speaking about sort of the ability to demonstrate and how it can make players feel. And the coach, for example, was demonstrating a switch of play, and they could ping the ball from on their right foot from one side of the pitch to the other, and they did it consistently and constantly. And they asked the player, then, can you do that? And the player went and did it, and couldn't do it, obviously, because technically they weren't the same standard. He went, no, not like that. Do it like this. Done it again. It got from A to B exactly. So it's something to really consider, that when we provide observation to people for them to go and model that and copy, that if the person who's observing is nowhere near technically as effective as that person who's delivering or modeling that action, then it can cause a little bit of uncomfortableness, or a little bit of demotivation. So again, it's recognizing the consequence, unintended impact, and the intended impact of why we do observation and stuff. So just something to consider as well with them things. Emma shared, during game breaks, I always lead with asking the girls what's gone well. When players are subs, ask them to tell me what players need to be marked closely. Yeah, so again, that links into that observation. Can you see these things? Guided discovery to my approach. Yeah, 100%, Mike. So when we use open questions or closed questions, or questioning in general, young players will definitely give you an answer they want you to hear. And you have to be really careful with that, because you have to then judge in that moment as a coach whether that person has the required knowledge to actually provide an answer which makes sense to them. So again, just recognise when to be more command when it's needed, because they might not have the required knowledge. And again, you can loosen that up over time. Again, it's not a right or wrong. It's no different if you're in school. We don't ask, oh, how can you do this equation? And you say, oh, just go and work it out. They need some basics there to probably support before they get to that stage. Yeah, so command might be really, an effective way of intervening, especially in a practice where, you're demanding certain players to do certain things. If you're going to do an unopposed practice, the coach has to take the stage generally, because if they don't, the players will just do whatever they want. So again, just so you get that balance right. If you do more game-based stuff, obviously you can get maybe a bit more of a blend. Young players being tasked with senior players, to learn from them, and it's make sure they're actively actually looking at what you ask them to look at. Don't say, "I'll watch him," because again, if they don't have the knowledge to know what they're looking for, they can't see the wood from the trees. So again, they might require some support with that. Mark said he generally starts with command, try explain, and allow trial and error. Observation, feedback, and maybe things to work out. These things again, it's just using the right tool at the right time. Watch the Spurs school coaches overly involved in games, which demotivates the kid because the coach is so much better. Yeah, it's just different. Yeah, different styles, different experiences. Not saying it's right or wrong. Obviously, within the context of this, I can't really comment any further than that. But different styles and that. Yeah, Q&A with under nines, discuss game scenarios. I've got a good experience of that once where we spoke. When I first started coaching, I had a really good question and answer sort of session, if you call it that, around attacking outnumbered, and the players were brilliant at providing answers. They went on the pitch and done everything except what they spoke about. And I learned very quickly that day that, holding knowledge is different. Knowledge of something is very different to knowledge in. So just think about when we're imparting knowledge, or we're trying to get players to improve their knowledge about something, their knowledge of something could be higher, and there could be a gap between their knowledge in. So the ability to actually see it and coach. This is why we have to be careful with not making football about memory and retention of information. It actually needs to be interacting with live information on the pitch. So getting that balance right between things. Okay, well, thanks everyone. So some really good thoughts today, and some really good input as well, which is really beneficial. So I guess a final thought from myself. When you are intervening or communicating, or you're coaching, and you're thinking about your behaviours, always try to respond to the needs of your players, but aligned to your agreed upon values and style of play. And the reason I say aligned and I say agreed is because if you're not aligned, then you're going to likely be more inconsistent as a coach. If it's not agreed upon between yourself and the players, then you may be doing stuff the players can't actually do right now. That may not be the case. So it's really key that if the players are bought into the agreed upon values and style of play, and then you align your interactions with that, and you respond to the needs of your players, you're probably in a really good footing. So just to sort of close up today, so some final considerations. You need to see it, understand it to coach it. So if you find yourself talking too much during games and you find yourself changing your emotion in what you say, do you actually understand the detail behind what you're saying enough to get that information over in a better and more effective way? If you don't say anything and just relax and go and do some homework and go and research it and find a better way of doing it. Ask your players, is there a better way of getting that information across? You know, be brave and ask your players to feedback on yourself. It's a really good thing to do. To be fair, is getting players to do maybe like an anonymous form or anonymous feedback to you as a coach, or even the parents, for example, and ask them what you think you do well, communication, what you think you might need to improve on, and you'll be really surprised at some of the answers. But just make sure it's anonymous, because otherwise, if it's not anonymous, they'll do exactly what they think that you want them to hear. As usual, let players explore, and even as a coach, explore these things, but guide their attention to recognising detail. It all comes back to attention. Provide encouragement, especially when you're trying new hard things for them to do, and have fun trying things out as a coach. So workshop summary, quite a lot of content today. I'm aware of that. So try and get a blended approach. You know, we spoke about them coaching considerations. Always think about getting a balance between things. The planning model, the importance of coach behaviours in that planning model. Sending and receiving information, verbal and non-verbal communication, the content you want to communicate, the emotion you attach to that content and delivery is really key, depending on what intent you want behind it. Ineffective communication examples. Think about how do you communicate. So, you know, always add value. First, do no harm. That balance between coach decides, two-way reciprocal relationship, and player decides. The intervention wheel, think about what bit you might need at what time, depending on the players you're working with and in the context, and always respond to the needs of the players, of your players.